Well, Tertullian once asked, what has Athens to do with Jerusalem? Today, we might ask the same questions of Silicon Valley. Many in the church view technological innovation at best as a secular matter, or at worst as a threat to family and congregational life. But in a broader view, the spread of the gospel has always ridden the tides of technological change. What might a theology of technology look like? And how might the church today adopt and adapt new and emerging technologies in ways to advance the kingdom of God? It is a strategic priority here at Colorado Christian University to advance the gospel of Jesus Christ, and we're so grateful tonight to host Timothy Dalrymple. Timothy Dalrymple is the president and CEO of Christianity Today, a global media ministry founded by Billy Graham. Christianity Today has been called evangelicalism's flagship magazine. After graduating from Stanford with a double major in philosophy and religious studies, Tim earned an MDiv at Princeton Theological Seminary and a PhD in modern Western religious thought at Harvard University. Along the way, he's also served in youth ministry, prison chaplaincy, and graduate and faculty ministry with InterVarsity Christian Fellowship. Tim's desire to thoughtfully engage the public square and to find creative ways of sharing the gospel in the new media marketplace found expression after Harvard in his work with the multi-religious website Patheos from 2008 to 2014. First, he was the managing editor of Patheos' Evangelical channel, and then director of content and vice president of business development. In 2013, Dr. Dalrymple founded Polymath, a creative agency that helps clients with branding, design, web, video, marketing, and communications and content development. Its clients have included the Museum of the Bible, International Justice Mission, the American Enterprise Institute, and Indiana Wesleyan University. Friends, please welcome to Colorado Christian University, Dr. Timothy Dalrymple.
Thank you guys for coming. Did we send you that biographical blurb? Well, it is overly kind. So thank you. For the students here in particular, and I will get closer to the microphone here in a moment, but for the students here in particular, there was a lot of failure and struggle and suffering along the way. I think sometimes we don't give the most encouraging picture when we only show the high points of life. If you could kind of see the backside of the resume, there were a lot of low points as well. So these are complicated stories, so don't be discouraged when only the high points are recited. Speaking of technology, we've had to navigate a little technological challenge, but thank you to Walter for your heroic efforts, and thank you to Sarah. So we're advancing two parallel but identical versions of the slide deck on my computer and that computer over there. So I wanted to start by telling two stories. I guess I'm a little shorter than you, so let's see. Make this work here. Yeah, I want to start by telling two stories. So one is represented in this painting that you see here. And you may not know the story of the true cross. The story of the true cross is not often told within Protestant circles. But when Empress Helena, Saint Helena, who was the mother of Emperor Constantine, made a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. In theory, she found the location of the cross that had been utilized for the crucifixion of Jesus. And there were nails, and there was the title that said Jesus, King of the Jews, at the top as well. This was kind of excavated out of an area that was near to where Christians had traditionally identified as the place of the crucifixion. And so this was welcomed as the true cross. Whether or not it was, I don't really know. But the true cross became this incredibly powerful emblem within the Christian world, and particularly the Byzantine Christian world. And so it resided in different places, but the largest portion of the true cross resided within Jerusalem. It was captured by a Sassanid Persian emperor, Khosrau II, and it was taken away. And then until the Emperor Heraclius, one of the Byzantine emperors, and if you're not familiar with the Byzantines, let me encourage you to get familiar with them. I remember when I was a student and discovered there's this whole other Roman Empire out there that lasted for 1,000 years later than the Western Roman Empire. It was really exciting, some fantastic stories, including this one. So Heraclius goes and he recaptures the true cross. And then he brings it back to Jerusalem, and he's prepared to enter into the city in this really triumphant way. So he has a crown on. You can see this in the top. You see the figure with the crown, and he's bearing a piece of wood, and he's wearing, all the resplendent robes of an emperor. And he's atop a very tall, white, richly caparisoned horse. And he's ready to enter in this grand procession, bringing the true cross back to its home in Jerusalem. But you might see there's an angel up there, and the angel is in fact blocking the way. And you might see there's an arch there that's actually been filled in. And the angel is saying, if you're going to bear the cross back into Jerusalem, if you're going to bear the cross as Jesus did, then you need to walk and enter the city in the same way. You can't do this on top of a high horse. So you'll see a little lower down there, a different image of Heraclius, who has gotten down off of his high horse. He is barefoot. He's taken off, the robes of the emperor, and he's entering now in humility. And when he does that, then the way is clear, and he's able to enter into the holy city. So we'll go to the next slide here. Now, this story became a very common story for Christian monarchs and rulers. And this is something that would be shared with you if you were being raised within Christendom and being cultivated to be a king or an emperor. Then you would be told this story, because this is a mark of Christian leadership. That Christian leadership does not stand upon its high horse or sit upon its high horse, but humbles itself in the image of Christ and walks in the way that Christ walked. So this is not the actual page where this appears, but this is a different page from the Charles V prayer book. Charles V was the Holy Roman Emperor during the time of the Reformation. And actually was a pretty good, as far as Holy Roman Emperors go, he was a pretty good one. But this was in his prayer book, as it was instructing him in what it looked like to be a good Christian leader. Now, I'll come back to this story in just a second, but now I'm going to tell a second story, and then we'll talk about what they have in common. So this second story, of course, you're going to recognize this figure as Mother Teresa, an extraordinary woman, Teresa of Calcutta, who was born elsewhere, came to India, and began in Calcutta to pick the dead and the dying, in particular the dying, off the streets and care for them. And out of that grew an entire movement, the Sisters of Charity, Missionaries of Charity. And this story, it didn't reach Charles V. This comes along much later, but it reached me. So I was about 14 when I first saw a documentary about Mother Teresa. And it was made by these two sisters, Jeanette and Ann Petrie. And I was languishing within kind of a very comfortable suburban Christianity. And I was wrestling with, on the one hand, the biblical call to die to ourselves, to take up our cross daily and follow after him. In contrast to what seemed like a very, very comfortable, even kind of beneficial form of Christianity that I saw around me, kind of a potluck Christianity, right? Isn't it the case I was struggling with? Isn't it the case that God calls us to something greater? Isn't it the case that discipleship to Jesus can have a really dramatic and radical cost? And so when I came across this documentary, it exposed me to a very different way of being a follower of Jesus Christ. It showed me a way of wholeheartedly self-sacrificing, giving yourself to whatever the path is that God is calling you down. Now, it may not be for me to go to the streets of Calcutta, but nonetheless that God was calling me to that complete a level of self-sacrifice in order to follow after him. Now, what do these stories have in common? So one of the things that they have in common is that both employ a kind of technology. On the one hand, you have an illuminated prayer book. Now, you may not be accustomed to thinking of something like that as an artifact of technology. However, it was. It's something that developed over the course of time, and we'll come back to that. There was a time when there were not those kinds of books that would convey information in those kinds of ways, right? That is something that had to develop. The other kind of technology was all the technologies that go around making a documentary and then distributing those around the world. So someone had to go, and they had the cameras and the editing suite, and they put all of this together, the audio, et cetera, right? All sorts of technological artifacts that are required in the capturing of that story, in editing it, shaping it, and then getting it to a person like me in the middle of the Central Valley of California so that my life could be changed. So both were carried by a form of technology. Both also have a story, right? Very simple. I don't have to belabor this point. One has the story of Heraclius returning the true cross to Jerusalem. Another has the story of Mother Teresa's humble service, inspiring a global movement. And you can move on to the next and the next. And they also had wisdom. And I'll try to ostentatiously tap here so you know I'm moving on. My bad for forgetting to do that. They also had a kind of wisdom that was being communicated, right? It wasn't just a story, but it was a story where truth was woven into the narrative thread. So on the one hand, you have a heroic Christian leader who is taught a lesson of being a humble Christ follower, that the true Christian monarch is someone who will humble himself and follow simply in the footsteps of Jesus Christ. Now, and that's why it was conveyed to a person like Charles V and to other young, aspiring, and designated future leaders. In the case of Mother Teresa, it had, well, there's this call to follow the call of Christ wherever it leads. So they all have technology, story, and wisdom, and that's going to be the structure of this talk. So let's talk about technology first. So if I asked you guys, what kind of technological artifact do you have on you right now? What are some of the first things that would come to mind? Cell phone. That's generally the first. You have a computer in front of you, so you lift that up. We think electronics, right? Now, do you have your computer? Do you have a backpack to carry it in?
I actually don't, but I probably should.
Yeah. We might want to think about a backpack. So how about the young woman next to you? Do you have a backpack or a bag or something like that?
I do have a backpack.
Okay. Now, is a backpack a form of technology? So it's a kind of transportation or containment form of technology that was really kind of came into its current form around the 50s or 60s by a person named Dick Kelty, who developed that. Okay, it was invented at a certain point in time. Hey, this would be a really convenient way for people to carry things, right? Now, how about, do you have a pencil inside of your backpack? Yeah. How about the pencil? Is the pencil a technology? Yeah. So it required a certain way of dealing with lead and graphite, if I recall correctly, and of getting the wood around it, right? And you had to get all these things in the right mixture, and the way of doing this was developed by an officer in Napoleon's army in the late 1700s. So we often think of technologies as electronic technologies, but the truth is technology is something that has been with humankind from the very beginning. So our word for technology comes from the Greek for technologia. And this referred to the study of the tools and techniques of the craftsman, artisan, or builder. Now, some of you might recognize the first part of that is tecton. The first part of it is incorporated into tecton. Now, the reason that's important is Jesus was a tecton and was the son of a tecton. So a tecton, a craftsman, a builder, again. So we like to talk about Jesus as a carpenter and Joseph as a carpenter. There wasn't actually a whole lot of wood around at that time in that place. So yes, they probably did work with wood in some of the building projects of the Herodian house around Sepphoris and places like that. But they also worked with stone and with whatever was available. May have been homes, may have also been furniture, and that sort of thing. This is a craftsman who can build things. The techni, then, so the tecton is a master of the techni, which is the crafts or technical skills that create something new and useful. And so that's where our word technology comes along. And a modern dictionary definition is that a technology is a tool or technique that increases our power to manipulate our environment. So it's probably wise at this point, since I'm going to talk about a theological framework for some of the positives of technology, to acknowledge that, of course, there are perils and pitfalls. And so we are rightly concerned that the proliferation of technology can dull the spiritual senses, that it can dissipate the powers of attention on which the practice of prayer depends, that we can fill our lives with so many blazing distractions that we forget about the eternal things, or that we become so transfixed with the glow of our screens in front of us that we no longer look at the stars and learn from the cosmos the things that we might learn. If we go beyond just an individual standpoint in the ways in which technologies shape us, because they shape us as much as we shape them, we could talk about, well, how is it shaping family life, right? So I have a 5-year-old girl. I have 3 girls, 11, 8, and 5. And the 5-year-old, every morning she walks in and says, "Can I watch your phone?" Because she just loves, that phrase even, watch your phone, right? That wouldn't have made sense when I was a kid, but it does now. She wants to get it. She wants to watch YouTube. You have children, obviously, being in different, locked in front of their screens, all in their own kind of virtual worlds, right? So we can have a right concern about things like pornography and just how readily available that is to anybody who's willing to type in a certain word or two, right? Going beyond the family, we could talk about congregations and how our technology is shaping congregational life, where it's so easy now. I don't need to necessarily go in and be a part of the community that worships together. I can stream the service from home. There are entire congregations that exist only online at this point, right? And there are a lot of good things about that. If I'm shut up in the house, then I'm really grateful that I can participate. And if I have no way of interacting with a good congregation near me, maybe it's fantastic that I have access to one online, but we're rightfully concerned about how it's shifting congregational life. We could go even larger to how it shapes us as a people or communities or nations or around the world, that a lot of the same technologies that can be used for fantastic purposes can also be used for deeply nefarious ones. So the same technology that develops medicines to heal diseases around the world can be used to develop biological warfare agents, right? The same facial recognition technology that we can use to identify the victims of sex trafficking or human trafficking, other forms of human trafficking around the world, that can be used to control, to monitor, surveil, and control citizens. We could go on and on. We all know that these technologies, they're essentially tools that can be used in positive or negative ways. There may be some technologies that really lean toward the negative, and there may be some that really lean toward the positive. But on the whole, we know that this is something that, like all other tools, can be used in positive and negative ways. Still, and we can still go back to the prior slide, still the Christian tradition offers a really rich theology of technology, and that might not be something that you're aware of. But especially, this starts as early as Basil of Caesarea in the 4th century. Some of the early Greek fathers, who ministered to a lot of tectons, to a lot of craftsmen. They had to develop a theology to help those craftsmen understand the importance in God's eyes of what they were doing. And so they helped to develop this theology of technology. That extends into the monastic tradition, especially around the 12th and 13th centuries, when you have a series of figures who reflected, and I'll get to those in just a moment, who reflected on how technology was shaping their lives, because they were using new technologies. I mean, the monastic communities actually innovated new technologies like the water wheel, and that changed the way that they interacted as a community. Suddenly they didn't have to do this backbreaking labor anymore, and they could focus on other things that might be more meaningful forms of labor. So within these traditions, God is often seen as the first technologist, actually. And why would that be? Well, it's because God was the one who made clothes. So that's pretty clever, right? So Adam and Eve, suddenly they were aware and ashamed of their nakedness. And so God crafted garments of skins to provide for them. And according to some of these theologians, that even points to kind of the ambiguity of technology. That it was both a response to sin, and yet it was something that added to the quality of their lives. That it was taking something even dead, in this case, a skin. Well, where do you get that? You get that from a dead animal, right? Similar to the ark, the building of the ark. Noah was welcomed as another technologist. He's a shipbuilder, right? Also taking dead things, formerly live things in the wood, and crafting out of that something that preserved the entire human species. No insignificant feat. Now, we could talk about the development of weaponry as well, which the Bible notes some of that, but also things like the building of the tabernacle or the building of the temple. And you could contrast that maybe with the Tower of Babel, another building project, another project that would have required a great deal of technological expertise, but was done for the wrong purposes, as opposed to something like the tabernacle or the temple, where all of these different craftspeople came together and utilized the gifts that God had given them to build something for his glory. Then that was something that was celebrated, right? So every now and then I just have to touch it to keep it awake. So we're still on the prior one. But Basil of Caesarea and Hugh of St. Victor both make this point that the craft of the technologist is essential to the restoration of the created order and essential to the living out of the imago Dei. So in a fallen world, we utilize these technologies to bring order. That's part of even the creation mandate prior to the fall, right? But after the fall, it's remediating some of the effects of the fall. So suddenly we find ourselves exposed to a harsh and unforgiving world. Well, the person then who builds a house is partaking in the restoration of the created order. We are created to be creators. This is the imago Dei part, that we are created in the image of a creator, and when we create in the way that he creates, we are living out the imago Dei and being who we are called to be. So we are crafted to be crafters by the master craftsman. For Bonaventure, then, the work of the technologist is an instrument of grace in the lives of others. It's an act of brotherly love. So if you're someone who creates the house that houses people against the storm and keeps out the robber, then you are exercising who God made you to be in such a way that you are loving that person. You're providing for that person, that family. If you craft the ship that survives through the storm, then that is an act of love. You're creating something meaningful. You're making the world more hospitable for human life and human flourishing. So the work of the technologist is actually an instrument of grace in the lives of others. It's actually a form of brotherly love. Now, they also talk about the works of the technologist, so the actual artifact, that those actually glorify God even more than the direct work of God's hands. So let me ask, how many of you have been out in nature? It may be you were looking at the stars, you were looking at the sunset, you were looking at the mountains or a waterfall, and you had a sense of the majesty, the awesomeness of God. Has that ever happened to you? Yeah. Now, how many of you have stood in front of an artifact of technology like this? Or, a laser array or something like that, some sort of impressive feat of technological craft, and felt transported to worship God as a result? Anyone? Okay, a couple of you. Good. Well, so the point that they're making here is that it is remarkable that God could create a mountain. But it is even more remarkable that God could create creatures who have the intelligence, the creativity, and the freedom to craft something like this. So God's might and majesty and intelligence and design is shown even more through the existence of something like this than it is shown through the existence of a mountain. Now, we could push a bunch of dirt together today. We can't create it out of ex nihilo, but we can put together mountains. We can put together something that looks like a tree, right? But can any of us create a creature who can create this? No. Are we going to get there someday? I have no idea. we're only now getting to where we can approach something that has some degree of agency or creativity. But it may or may not ever get to kind of maybe a qualitatively distinct sort of thing that we have. So I've really found that to be a very interesting shift of perspective. That being in a technological space, I think we're inclined to, the reason that we don't glorify God when we see this is we think, well, we glorify Steve Jobs, right? And the engineers who put something like this together. All right, and we tend to view technology as it's kind of an ongoing proof of the power of the scientific approach to things. And we might view the scientific approach to things as, at best, faith neutral or irrelevant faith, and at worst as kind of antagonistic to faith. Well, I don't think this is the way that the church historically has seen it. But this has been a really interesting shift of perspective for me, that I can be reminded to glorify God even by those cameras that are over there, and by the computer that's in front of me, and this technology. All of the technologies that God gave us the creativity, the intelligence, the agency to make, and that in many cases were made by people who believed that these were going to do a good thing. And so they exercised a role of love and restoration within the world. Now we come to the point, and we can switch now, to the spread of the gospel, and this was mentioned in the sort of blurb for this talk, has really ridden the tides of technological innovation. Now you'll notice I put in parentheses there, story and wisdom. So the spread of the gospel takes place through story, right? You think about those three categories we had. We had technology, story, and wisdom. So the gospel is large, if you look at the gospels, it's largely stories, right? Wisdom is woven into those, sometimes explicitly, sometimes left for us to interpret in those stories. But the gospel, the stories and wisdom of the gospel, the truth of the gospel, has spread around the world on the tides of technological innovation. So think, for instance, about early transportation technologies. The Roman road system, which in many ways wouldn't be equaled for over a millennia after the fall and decline of the Western Roman Empire. That was a large part of what allowed the early Christian church to spread as quickly as it did. You think about ships, right? And the ability to travel on ships and to have navigation on ships, all of which required technologies. You could think about early communications technologies. We went from having papyrus rolls and wax tablets as ways of capturing information to parchment and to paper and to finer inks and getting into things like the codex. We'll come back to this shortly. The codex is what you think of as a book. Okay, it's usually handwritten as part of the definition for a codex. But it's the first time when books were actually being put together instead of scrolls. It's called a codex. That was a technology that developed. Bookbinding, illumination, illuminated texts and manuscripts, stained glass for people who can't read was a great way of communicating the stories of the gospel, and eventually into things like the printing press. You could think about modern transportation, such as, steamboats that allowed the Cambridge 7 to go on their missionary journeys and write about it in a way that electrified the world. You could think about the airplanes that took somebody like Jim Elliot, or that even today take the Mission Aviation Group. What's it called? Fellowship, MAF, that is doing fantastic work all around the world today. You could talk about mass communications technology. So we'll get to that in just a second. But this is a codex. I think this is the Aleppo Codex. And the codex was almost the iPod of the ancient world. It allowed you to store more information in a more condensed and more portable form. So prior to this, you had scrolls. Now try to imagine you have one scroll, the book of Matthew, about 30 pages, 30 feet long as a scroll. And you're trying to do a study between the book of Matthew and, let's say, the book of Isaiah, which is maybe, let's say, a similar length or even longer, right? And you're having to kind of maneuver through this, and then you maneuver over there, and you want to reference back and forth. It gets very difficult. And it took up a huge amount of space to carry all of these scrolls. It was not very portable. It was not very practical. Christians were actually amongst the earliest adopters of the Codex. So if you look in the first couple centuries of Christianity, if you're looking and you're discovering a manuscript, and you discover a scroll from that time, you can be almost certain it's not Christian. Only 2%. This is by a study from Larry Hurtado, by the way. Only about 2% of the scrolls that you find from those first couple centuries are Christian. If you find a codex, you can be pretty sure it is Christian, because 75% of the codices that we have from those first couple centuries were Christian. Christians were early adopters of this new technology because they're a people of the book. They were constrained by their ability to take the book elsewhere, right? Jews are people of the book too, but not as motivated by missionary zeal as Christians are. And so as they wanted to take the gospel to new places, they needed to bring the book with them. So they adopted the new technology as soon as it came out. Now, if you go a little further, go to the next, then you get to these illuminated manuscripts, right? Which again make it more compelling, more interesting. Suddenly people are going to want to engage with it more. We'll go to the next. You get to the printing press. Well, the very first thing that was printed on the printing press, of course, was a Vulgate Bible, right? The printing of the Bible was a huge part of the early growth of the printing press. So you have, again, Christians who are leveraging the emerging technology. By the time you get to the Reformation, in the first 3 years or so after Martin Luther posted his 95 Theses, even by the end of those 3 years, you had about 300,000 copies of Martin Luther's pamphlets. By the time Erasmus died, I think 1530-something, there were about 750,000 copies of his works in print, and all of that was because of the development of the printing press. Now we could jump forward to the radio. The very first radio broadcast was a Christmas Eve service with Bible readings and Christmas carols. And some of the great evangelists of that time, like Billy Sunday and Dwight Moody, D.L. Moody, leveraged this emerging technology to reach far more people than they could have otherwise. Now, my organization, Christianity Today, was founded by Billy Graham. And Billy Graham leveraged television. He had a program that he put out that spread the gospel to a far wider audience, translated and so forth and spread around the world than he ever could have reached just in person. And we could even talk about newspapers at this point too, newspapers even earlier, but it was a decision by William Randolph Hearst to, quote, puff Graham. He sent out a message to all of his newspapers and said, puff Graham, as the Billy Graham crusades began to grow, that really helped. All of the coverage really helped grow the renown, and suddenly all of these cities wanted Billy Graham to come and share the gospel to them. I mentioned a few others, the Mission Aviation Fellowship. You can talk about YouVersion. Who has YouVersion on their phone, or some version of a Bible app, right? Or you can go online. You don't need an app. You can go to Bible Gateway. You can go to a number of other places, right? Something called the Global Media Outreach, which is a sort of flotilla, an archipelago of websites that are out there for people who are seeking and asking questions, and they all are intended to kind of funnel people into a process that can lead to putting them in touch with a person for prayer and for conversion, right? You could talk about water purification technologies, that there are some fantastic Christian ministries that are able to build the presence that they have because they have water purification technologies that they're able to carry to places that desperately need that. You could talk about film. I was thinking about this earlier, and I was thinking about the Kendrick brothers. Am I getting that name right? I interviewed them once, so I should remember the name. But, they decided that we as a church are going to be a filmmaker. And, whatever you think of the films themselves, and I think they've gotten progressively better in terms of production value and so forth as they go along, it's really fascinating, isn't it, that a church decided we're going to be a filmmaker? A lot of churches are effectively a missionary. We send missionaries out, right? This is what we do collectively. Or we're going to minister to our local, and sure, they do those sorts of things at this church in the middle of nowhere in Georgia, but they decided we're going to be a filmmaker. And so they went ahead and started producing these films, and they have over half of their congregation is usually involved in the filmmaking in some way, either helping out with the sets or the production, or they're showing up and they're on screen and so forth. Really a fascinating decision, and because of that, this church in the middle of nowhere in Georgia has reached people all around the world. Now that's a technology story as much as it is anything else, right? I'll come later to what we're doing at Christianity Today. But the point here being that it is easy for us to fall into a kind of reflexive anti-technology mode and be fearful of what new and emerging technologies are doing to our lives as individuals and our lives together. And those are very real concerns, and those are things that need to be thought through. But there is also a very rich tradition within the history of Christian theological reflection that has a much more positive view of the powers and the potential of technology. Now, as I mentioned earlier, it was partly this combination of technology, story, and wisdom that I think is really so powerful. So think about story. Now, why is story so important? Eugene Peterson has this great quote that the Holy Spirit's literary genre of choice is story. So depending on how you measure it, about 65% of the Bible is told in story form, right? There's also poetry, there's also kind of wisdom or straightforward exposition and teaching, but the vast majority of the Bible comes in the form of story. And when you think about the teaching method of Jesus, how much of that comes through story? A huge amount, right? There is straightforward preaching, like what you'll find in the Sermon on the Mount. But there are story after story, parable after parable that Jesus tells in order to convey the truth. Now, why would God and why would Jesus choose to use story so dramatically? Well, let me see. Let's jump ahead to the next screen. And I think a big part of why this is the case is that we largely live our lives in terms of stories. Now, if I said to Jeff, who are you? Who are you really? And he responded back and said, well, I have blue eyes. I think it's blue. I have long hair. I have this great beard that I'm growing out right now. It's a very manly beard. I like it. And gave me just kind of the vitals, like this is what my height, my weight. I wouldn't feel like he really answered the question, right? If I pressed him on the point, and eventually we would probably get to him telling me his story, right? Well, I'm someone who was born in a certain place. I was born into a family like this. Even if he just told me his profession, I'd say, well, that's what you do. That's not necessarily who you are. And once he got past those layers of superficiality, eventually he'd get to the story part. And we think of ourselves, who am I really? Well, we think of ourselves in terms of story. This is part of why the loss of memory later in life is so terrifying, because you lose the stories that really make up a huge part of your identity. Right? I think about myself, and I've had to tell and retell my story over and over throughout my life. And your story looks different at different intervals. So I actually was a gymnast when I was younger. I don't remember if this came up in the bio blurb. But that was a huge part of my early life, and I won some national all-around championships and competed internationally for the U.S. And I actually fell from the high bar and broke my neck in my sophomore year at Stanford. I had gone to Stanford and was competing for Stanford. Now, I had a certain story that I thought that I was living, that story was going to take me to the Olympic Games. And something was going to happen, and I was going to be able to kind of glorify God, and maybe myself, I was a young person. But, and that's the story that I thought that I was living, right? But then something happens, and the end of that story gets cut off. Or what I thought was the end. I have a different end to the story now, and I need to reinterpret it, right? Now, all of you can probably think of stories within your own lives that you've had to reinterpret. And so as events go along, well, immediately after this, I went to see a film. Robert Downey Jr. starred in it, and he was, it's called Restoration, and he was a monk, and he goes up to the door of a monastery, and on the words written on the door of the monastery are, "Behold, I have refined you in the furnace of affliction." And I went and I looked those verses up in Isaiah 48, 10 and 11, and it goes on to say, it's for my own name's sake that I do this. How could I let my glory go to another? Now, this was suddenly I had a different way of interpreting my story. It wasn't just that I broke my neck. It was that I was being refined and prepared for something else, right? And eventually you see how this part of my life prepared me for this part, which prepared me for this part, and it all weaves together in a dramatic way that you never could have understood at the time. So my point here is that we are storytelling creatures, and we are defined by the stories we tell about ourselves. And one of the things that these biblical stories do is that they take our stories and they wrap them up in a larger story. And sometimes that story is wrapped up in a larger story too of God's redemption and restoration of all things. So these are some great quotes. To be a person is to have a story to tell. That we are fundamentally comprised of stories. Or God made man because he loves stories. I love that quote from Elie Wiesel. But again, so just to summarize the points here, on to the next. When pressed on who we really are, most of us would tell our stories. And sometimes our stories only become clear in retrospect. We're storytellers made in the image of a storyteller. We cannot help but tell stories. Also, stories change lives, right? When I came in contact with that story of Mother Teresa, that changed my life. It called me into a bigger story. They make the sense of the lives that we've lived, like I was just talking about with my gymnastics experience, but they might also call us to live lives that we have not yet lived. C.S. Lewis has a great quote, and I didn't put it up here, but about how, if you never read a book, you only live one life. But if you read the stories of others, you can live 1,000 lives, right? You can enter into the narrative, the life stories of other people, and learn the things that they learned along the way. Oh, I did put it in here. Okay, so the man who is contented to be only himself and therefore less a self is in a prison. My own eyes are not enough for me. I will see through those of others. Let's talk briefly about wisdom. So these aren't just stories, right? And there are times even in the New Testament where Jesus is telling a story, but the disciples don't get it. So the story of the sower. This is a painting from Van Gogh. The story of the soils or the story of the sower. They didn't get it, right? And so he had to give an explanation for them. But there was a lesson about receptivity to the gospel. There was a lesson about how kind of the gospel is spread out amongst different sorts of people in different situations in life that was woven into the narrative of the sower, of the parable. So wisdom is woven into story. Wisdom and story need one another. We're able to convey some things and impact people in a way that we could not through the telling of stories. The storyteller enables us to borrow the lives of others and learn from their experiences. The storyteller helps us learn from the hero of the story and helps inform and inspire the next generation of heroes. And that's, maybe I'll just make that point a little clearer, that, I wrote my doctoral dissertation on Kierkegaard. Any Kierkegaard fans? Yeah? Okay. Thank you, Doug. It's good to see you, by the way. So Kierkegaard has a little theme on the poet and the hero, and how the poet and the hero both need one another in order to be themselves, right? The hero is his own or her own worst storyteller. And a hero doesn't really become a hero, as in being a hero to others, which is part of the point of being a hero, is inspiring others, unless there's a poet there to tell the story. The poet doesn't have a story to tell unless there's a hero, right? And so the poet comes along and tells that story of the hero and wraps, there's some truth wrapped into that, some value intrinsic within the story, and spreads that story out into the world and raises up the next generation of heroes. So this is the interwoven nature of storytelling and wisdom, that the story spreads and it carries wisdom with it. Here's another example, right? Here is a technology that is stained glass that became very popular as a teaching mechanism, especially to those who were illiterate. And what do you have represented here? Anybody recognize what it is? Yeah, it's the Good Samaritan. So here's a story, a parable, and wisdom is wrapped into it. What kind of wisdom? Well, the kinds of lessons that you would draw from, the person who shows, kind of the unexpected person who shows love to someone in need and thereby makes himself a neighbor through his actions, right? Now, there's one point here that I want to make, that men and women once lived their lives under a canopy of biblical stories. The Bible was kind of the shared storybook of the entire culture. Biblical stories were woven into art and architecture and music and theater, poetry, and so on. I mean, it was a way that you could connect with other people. You knew the stories, they knew the stories. If you said, well, that's like when Abraham, was called to sacrifice Isaac, then they would know what you're talking about. It was kind of a lingua franca. And from that canopy of stories under which people lived their lives, there were truths that fell down into the soil of their souls and enriched their understanding of God. And then that constant comparison of our own story to those stories that we find in the Bible developed wisdom and a longing to be more than what we are. Now, all the stories were not stories of people doing heroic things, right? But you could find yourself in Moses, who did something terrible in a moment of anger, or you could find yourself in David, and you could find yourself in the more heroic stories as well, or the self that you wanted to be. So here's another example, something in a painting. Does anybody recognize this? Yeah, Rembrandt, the prodigal son story. So another story that has wisdom wrapped into it. Also, here's another one, a different kind of technology if we move on to Charlton Heston here, our good friend Charlie. So a film conveying a story to a much broader audience that had wisdom written into it. If we go ahead to the next, this is an image from The Passion of the Christ. Again, a film in much more developed form, conveying a story that has wisdom wrapped into it. Now, I want us to ask ourselves briefly, what is the narrative canopy of today? What's kind of the shared storybook that we have within our culture? Does anybody have any thoughts? So these days, you can't take for granted that people are going to know the biblical stories, right? What stories might you be able to take for granted people will know? At least in your circles. Here, movies? Anything in particular come to mind? I mean, all of them to some extent, but Star Wars? I think somebody said Star Wars. Yeah. Superhero, yeah. So the Marvel Cinematic Universe, right? Great sort of canopy of stories in Star Wars or Harry Potter. I mean, things that have really permeated the culture. These are kind of the canopy of stories we live under today. Forrest Gump. All right. And and so we can ask ourselves what kind of truths, what kind of wisdom is being conveyed by these stories? Well, not necessarily bad things. I think there's a lot of great stuff in, let's say, the Marvel Cinematic Universe. A lot of virtues that are represented well, and friendships and love and self-sacrifice. Not necessarily the same lessons that were conveyed in biblical stories, when that was kind of the shared storehouse of stories that we lived by. But nonetheless, not the worst. So here's the Marvel Cinematic Universe on the next one. Had fun kind of finding a picture for that. But if you go to the next, hey, what's another story that people spent maybe even more time with? Game of Thrones, right? If you watched every episode, it was over 70 hours of content, right? Which I think goes further than the Marvel Cinematic Universe. But that's a fairly significant investment of time. And that's not even a lot compared to some other television series that went on for much longer. But so people spent, let's say it was 75 hours with Game of Thrones. Now, how many of those people also spent 75 hours consuming biblical stories? Maybe not a lot. And this is not even, okay, and what were some of the truths that were being communicated here? Maybe not all bad. There may be some things to appreciate, but also, some things that are probably a little less than biblical, let's say. And this is not even to get into things like computer gaming. You talked earlier about David French. I guess he's come to speak here before. David French is obsessed with World of Warcraft. This is an amazing guy, Harvard-trained lawyer, went in and fought in the Iraq War, or served as an attorney during the Iraq War, and has become a real thought leader. Loves to play World of Warcraft. I've jumped on and played with him before. You have people who have spent 1, 2, even 3 years of their lives playing World of Warcraft. Not 3 years over which they played World of Warcraft. But if you added all the minutes together, because it keeps track of your number of minutes, people who've spent 1 or 2 or 3 years doing these things, right? What's the power of that? You're living out a different sort of story. And again, I'm not reflexively negative about these things. I think there are some good and some bad, but it's something for us to think about, that these are technologies that are conveying story and conveying wisdom in a way that in some ways competes, right, with us. Now, what we're doing at CT, I'll just say very briefly, because it's not really the point, but part of what we're doing, if you go to the next slide, you'll see, how did the world learn about Mother Teresa? It was an AP reporter by the name of Joe McGowan. So Joe McGowan was covering India and some other countries in that region, and he called a friend of his in Calcutta and said, hey, do you have any stories for me? And the friend told him, there's this funny little old lady who's walking around and picking people up off the street and caring for them in their dying moments, caring for the poorest of the poor. And other people are coming and following and doing the same thing. So Joe McGowan decided, wow, that's really interesting. I'm going to go and I'm going to tell that story. And that's how the world learned about Mother Teresa. At Christianity Today, we really want to be a storyteller for the global church, finding men and women in every corner of the globe, in all professions, who are every day of the year following the call of Jesus in ways that are redemptive and transformative and unimpeachably good, like this. And what we try to do as we capture those stories, which carry wisdom within them, is create a sort of network, right? Christianity Today is a technological operation, whether that's the publication of the print edition, or whether that is, what is the vast majority of Christianity today, which is the online component. And so we're going around the world right now, hiring people to be editors, national or regional editors in different places around the world, sourcing content globally, then redistributing it globally and localizing it for people in their contexts. So localizing sometimes in terms of pricing, sometimes in terms of language, but creating a system where there's almost kind of a central nervous system for the body of Christ around the world, that wherever you visit from, you'll be able to see something that foregrounds the content from your area, but also gives you a bigger picture. Because these are the stories that the world knows the best. Go back to the prior. These stories are told all day long, right? I mean, the secular press is very happy to tell the stories of the falls from grace and cases of hypocrisy. Now, I'm not saying everybody up there, these are just kind of the stories that circulate and come to many to represent what it means to be an evangelical. So we want to be the ones who are out there telling the opposite kinds of stories. So we feel like our calling is to be a storyteller and sage of the global church. So let me close with a few thoughts, and then we'll take questions. So, number one, who are the storytellers of today, and what is the wisdom that is woven into their stories? So my hope is that some of you, and maybe some who are not here, students who are at Colorado Christian University, might feel a call to be storytellers in a time like this. Because stories of the biblical stories, but also the stories of the saints and the stories of people who are following the call of Jesus are so incredibly important and so need to be told. And yet, our own storytelling operation as Christians has been so anemic. And we are not telling stories at the same level of quality that the broader culture is. And then, how can we leverage new and emerging technologies today to carry the stories and the wisdom of the gospel into more hearts and minds? So you may be on the storytelling side, you may be on the wisdom side, you may be on the technology side. If so, I hope you can think about redemptive uses of technology and ways in which you can stand in that history of how the church has ridden the tides of technological innovation and how the gospel has spread and churches have flourished because of technological change. So maybe some of you can be on the forefront of that today. Thank you.
We're going to do questions now. We have students that will come by with the microphone. Please wait for the microphone so that people watching online can hear.
Question is, what guidelines and guardrails do you utilize in determining the use of technology?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great question. And do you mean kind of within a family context or more broadly?
Well, in the sense that you spoke earlier that
Yeah.
some uses of technology can be good and beneficial, and
Yeah.
yet they can drift into the wrong purposes. So
Yeah.
do you determine that? Do you study about it? Do you think about it as it applies to, let's say, Christianity today?
Yeah.
In terms of either content or how you employ technology throughout the world.
Yeah, well, I think it's a fantastic question, and at every sphere, whether we're talking about technology's impact on the individual or the family or the congregation or the community, the people, the country, the world, all will require a great deal of thought. There are some great books, in particular on the family, right? Andy Crouch's The Tech-Wise Family, for instance, is a good place to start. Andy's maybe a little more anti-technology than I am, but I do look for rhythms that that honor kind of a Sabbath principle. And so with my kids, for instance, I'll only let them use a screen on the weekends to the extent that they read. So if they want 2 hours on the screen, they have to read for 2 hours in order to get time on the screen. During the weekdays, it's not as much of an issue for us. But trying to find that, as well as rhythms where you have maybe one day a week that's pretty technology free, and you're trying, now you can't be entirely technology free, but you can get off the grid or something like that and be, because I think having those moments of silence, those moments of reflection, those moments when you can hear your own voice are really critical. So if I were then to kind of get up to the more macro level, I feel like we're just kind of crashing ahead with technological innovation without a whole lot of thought about it. And we used to about the implications and ways in which it can be used. And there are some efforts underway. There's one, Faith in AI right now, for instance. A very interesting group of people, including people from a lot of tech, from within the tech industry, who want to establish a rich way of thinking about technological innovation, in particular in the area of artificial intelligence, and where is that taking us? And so I wish that I had a simple answer to that. I don't, but I think it's a really important area for us as Christians to mine. And I would love for Christians really to model, because I don't see the secular culture really doing a lot of this, to model how can we think deeply, richly, theologically about technology and what it means, about what constitutes a positive or helpful use of technology, what constitutes a negative one, what kinds of controls should there be. So pornography would be another area where there's a lot of debate right now, even in the conservative side of things, between libertarians and non-libertarians and kind of their attitudes toward pornography. Is it something that could be outlawed? Could it at least be regulated? So that's one example of a technology these days that has enabled pornography to be more pervasive than ever, that has really facilitated also the rise in sex trafficking and the rise in the online sexual exploitation of children. That has just been absolutely devastating. And there are ministries that are working to combat that, like International Justice Mission, but there's not a whole lot of serious theological work, in my opinion, that at least that I've seen. And so if anybody's aware of that, I'd love to hear more about it. Another question? Over here? Hold on. Oh, sorry.
Thank you. How many people are on your staff that make this go?
There are about 75 people on staff at Christianity Today. And around that is a larger network of freelance writers. So in a newspaper, you tend to employ reporters. In a magazine, you tend to employ editors. And so most of our, on the editorial side, they're mostly editors, and then the writers are more like freelancers. Yeah. A couple down here.
The Tower of Babel is a classic example of technology and interfering with technology. When God came down, he made a statement that whatever they have set their minds to do, they will do. You think that was more of an admonition, or it was an encouragement that men will do all kinds of things way beyond your imagination, in fact?
That's great. So we often just kind of pass right over that verse, I guess, don't we? I've never really thought about it that deeply. But when earlier we were talking about the ability, we were talking about artificial intelligence, although we didn't use that term, about the ability to create creatures that can create, right? Are we ever going to get to the point where we can create something that is very similar to a human being? And you might look at a verse like that and say, well, maybe we could. Maybe we could. Maybe that's not a threat. I mean, again, maybe that's something that demonstrates God's creativity even more, that he could create beings who can create in their own turn and create really, really extraordinary things. So whether that's now that was, prior to the scattering, and so there was then the scattering. I mean, he says that, and so that's part of why he scatters them and introduces discord and things like that, right? So in today's world, in the post-Babel world, are we able to do anything we put our minds to? I guess would be an open question. There was a question right behind.
Thank you for being here. This is a fascinating conversation. You talked about the evolution of technology and how it has led to the spread of the gospel around the world. From Billy Graham and using just broadcast television to then satellite television and now the internet and everything that goes along that. What do you see as the next technology breakthrough that will help us in the spread of the gospel around the world?
Well, let me mention a few that are already doing so. So there's a story that takes place in a Southeast Asian country, a gentleman I'll call Chanda, who had been involved in using the radio to share sermons and so forth to his countrymen. But that was shut down by a government that was not in favor of proselytizing. Now, he went into an area where there was no cell reception, and he saw somebody who was listening to his phone. And he said, well, there's no cell reception. How are you able to do this? And the guy says, well, actually, I'm listening to sermons. Or I don't know if it was sermons. I'm listening to something that's on the little card that I put into my phone, right? And Chanda learned, okay, well, maybe I could start loading up on these little cards sermons and Bible readings, and that can be how I can spread these. And last I knew, he's distributed this to over 900,000 people within his country. So there are a lot of stories that we're not allowed to tell or have to tell in different ways. If we were able to talk or publish, I mean, I think it's okay to talk about here, but, places where, whether it's in Iran, where there's huge growth, there are a lot of conversions happening right now in Iran, especially amongst women, or in the refugee camps in Greece of people who are fleeing from Syria and places like that. A lot of that is facilitated through technology, through social media in particular. And when I go to places, I was just in India, and one of the guys that I was with showed me, I don't remember if it was WeChat or Line or what it was. Different countries have different social media that tend to predominate in their space. But he was showing me, he's part of this group that's keeping track of all the cases of persecution. And so he showed me on his phone, and it's just streaming one story after another of persecution around the country of India. So social media is already doing a lot. It's become an incredible way for the propagation of the gospel. As far as what might be next, I wish that I knew, but I do think that what we're attempting to do at Christianity Today, of putting together what would really be a global interconnected storytelling network for the body of Christ, I don't think that was even really possible 5 or 10 years ago. I think technologically it's possible today in a way that's not been before. And if you even think about kind of travel and communication technologies over time, it was probably, early in the history of the church, you might have let's call it body awareness, where you know what's happening in the body of Christ in your community. You might have been able to have that within your town. Or if you're in a big city, maybe kind of a part of your town. And then as transportation and communication technologies get a little bit better, then you might be able to know in a larger swath of land, right? And maybe eventually in a country. I think it's today with the internet, with the World Wide Web, that we're able to have a body awareness around the world that hasn't really been possible before. So that's exciting. So it's easy for me to just kind of extend on what current technologies are. But one thing that I didn't really mention is just all of the medical technologies that helped facilitate missionary work. So when missionaries went, they weren't just bringing the gospel. They were often bringing medical technologies or irrigation and agricultural technologies. You could even think about the agricultural technology that developed in the Roman Empire and helped to pacify a lot of the barbarian tribes. And then as the Roman Empire became more Christian, it helped to spread the gospel in that way, right? Yeah, I'll just stop there. Yes, toward the back.
Your answer made me think of a couple things I want to just explore with you. You and I were both at Manila in June, and AI and IoT, there was a big breakout session in that regard. Is the future of Christianity Today magazine this global networks, global and local, or are you looking to go even further with AI and IoT into perhaps exploring ways to reach the unreached, the 15 to 20% of the world who've never met a Christian, who don't know the gospel? If you could enlighten us as to what kind of specific things you're doing.
So one thing that I would like to do that I think is technologically simpler to do today than it was before is have more user-generated content. So it's maybe easy for us to kind of sit on our perch and think that these are the stories that need to be told, and it's kind of top-down storytelling, right? But we don't know all the stories. We don't know what's going on in the communities. If you think about Patch, I don't know how many of you remember Patch. It was kind of a local news technology that allowed people to report on things that were going on within their communities. And then things could rise up. So that was kind of bottom-up storytelling, user-generated storytelling. And I think it's presumptuous of us in an age when we actually can do that. It wasn't always possible to do that, to think that we know all the stories to tell. So there may be ways of shaping it so that we can do that. As far as artificial intelligence and Internet of Things, I think there are some things to be done with utilizing other devices that are, things like Alexa or Siri or whatever the Google version is, Hey Google, to develop a presence within people's lives. But I'm not sure yet what an interesting application would be otherwise within IoT. If you have any thoughts, let me know. There are some things that are being done right now with big data crunching. So in Thailand, for instance, there's a church planting network that's using big data a great deal to determine where to plant churches. And it's been fantastically successful. We wrote a story about this recently, and the individual wrote us back and said that they just had partly as a result of the story, so getting to the importance of storytelling, but it elevated their work, and they just had a baptism of almost 700 people that was, for them, far larger than anything they had had before. So there is some of that, especially in church planting, and I know of efforts like that in the U.S. too. Because picking the right spot can make a lot of difference. All right, there's a question over here.
Do you know which platforms work for you, such as like which social medias will work for Christianity Today, and which ones don't, that you fall back and say, okay, we'll close this down and try this other site, or
Yeah, it was. So I'll go back even to my experience at Patheos. So that was mentioned in the bio blurb at the beginning. So I was a part of helping to launch and grow a multi-religious website, where the idea was to reproduce online the marketplace of religious ideas and hopefully elevate it, make it better. And there's something there to offend everybody. So if you go visit it, don't blame me for everything that you see there. But what we found was that different religious communities had different social media. So evangelicals were mostly on Facebook, at least at that time. There were more, if you wanted to kind of catch the Catholic thought leaders, then you should put something on Twitter. If you wanted to reach neo-pagans, which I'm sure you do all the time, then it was stumble upon, which I'm not even sure if that, no, I'm sorry. Maybe it was dig, but stumble upon was big for, another smaller kind of niche community. At Christianity Today, so we certainly use Facebook and Twitter quite a bit. Twitter doesn't drive as much traffic, but it does reach thought leaders that in a way that Facebook does not necessarily. Facebook doesn't drive as much traffic as it used to, but it still does. Instagram, CT, unfortunately, has not had a full-time social media person. So this is something that I started recently, is something that will be changing soon. But Instagram is a fantastic storytelling platform, really in a way that Facebook is not. So if you're looking for, suddenly it's no longer that social media are just a way of referring people to your website. They're actually publishing platforms unto themselves and storytelling platforms. So leaning creatively in how to do social storytelling is pretty important. So I mentioned the ones that are most important for us here in the US. But again, you go overseas and it's WhatsApp, it's WeChat, it's Line, it's a variety of things. If you get into more persecuted communities, then you're talking more protected things like Signal. So part of the job of our national and regional editors in different places around the world will be to understand this is how content is disseminated within our community and to help us figure that out and do it. Yeah. Question here, last question.
How do you track and look at the demographic of people who get the publication? They're in households or with individuals that are not converted. Is there any way of tracking that and seeing how that can work? For example, media tends to tell us that the Pope is the voice and the face of Christianity today. And I've heard this a number of times.
Not of Christianity Today, but of Christianity today.
Yeah, no,
yes.
Sorry, that's not what I meant. So the question is, how do you know who you're reaching that may not be Christian, but this is really affecting them, and this is having an impact, or can you follow that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So anyone who works in the online media space, or even has a fairly solid grasp of social media, you know that you can get some data pretty readily, right? You can get pretty rich demographic data on who is engaging your content. Or using things like Google Analytics or other, there's a different Alexa that's largely analytics as well. Those don't often tell you kind of people's religious affiliation. And in most cases, deliberately so. You're not allowed to target. On Facebook, for instance, if you're running a media campaign, you can't target and say, I just want to reach Christians or a certain stripe of Christian. You have to approximate that through interests. And so I want to reach people who are interested in Josh McDowell or something, right? Something that nobody would say unless they're a Christian. Maybe that came out badly. I didn't mean it to. So you're left really with surveys. And then you're left with kind of the problem of who chooses to respond to surveys. Now, I will say, I know that historically CT has largely thought of itself as a publication for Christians. I do think going forward, we believe our call is to be a storyteller of the global church. And in that way, to make the church more beautiful and to make its beauty known to the world. And we cannot achieve that mission if we're not reaching non-Christians. So there will be different streams of content that reach different kinds of people. So there will be certain things like CT pastors or preaching today or church law and tax that are, for very niche groups. And I say niche, but the church leaders that we reach, we estimate that we have a strong relationship. So we reach a lot more, right? We reach millions of people, but we have a strong relationship with 250,000 church leaders. And that those church leaders each reach about 600 within their congregations is kind of the typical congregational size of people that we're actually reaching in that space. So that you multiply that, it's a huge reach, right? But where we find stories that we think are really compelling, then we want to tell those stories for the world. And I mentioned this to a couple people over lunch, but did any of you see Free Solo, the documentary? I would think there'd be a higher density of people in Colorado who saw that. Or maybe the Mr. Rogers documentary, not the feature film that's out now, but Won't You Be My Neighbor, right? These are fantastic stories now that of people doing extraordinary things. And the latter, so the reason I bring up the former, the Free Solo, is I think they are men and women climbing their own, Christians climbing their own El Capitan every day of the year, right? Who are doing extraordinary self-sacrificial things that are dangerous and almost impossible to achieve, and against overwhelming odds, they're succeeding. And we want to be telling those stories. I tell the Fred Rogers story because you see that and you're just moved, right? Christian or not. And it tells the story well, and you also find out along the way, by the way, he does this because he's a Christian. He's a Presbyterian minister. And so you have people coming away like, and I'll wrap up here, you have people coming away like Sarah Silverman, not a Christian, pretty antagonistic. And she posts something to Twitter that says, Fred Rogers was a conservative and pro-life, Republican and pro-life, and he's my hero. We want to tell stories like that, of people doing things that are unquestionably good. We want the world to see those, because the world needs to know that God doesn't just inspire the Jimmy Swaggarts and Jim Bakkers, right? God inspires the Fred Rogerses of the world, the Mother Teresas of the world. And I'll stop there. So, thank you very much.